Hi, my name is Tom Riordan, and welcome to the Cookieless Present. Today, I'm sitting with Chris Williams, Chief Marketing Officer at Arima. Prior to joining Arima, Chris worked at the Association of Canadian Advertisers and was president of IAB Canada. Chris, before we get started today, would you mind giving the audience a quick intro to Arima and then talk a little bit about your roles and priorities as CMO?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. As you pointed out, I've been doing some things on the association side. And in my 30 years of working with digital advertising, this is my first startup. And so it's pretty exciting to get into the cutting edge stuff where, people are building out code, offering new things, and the challenge of establishing some sort of new concepts and new approaches to things that have been around for quite a long time. And I mean, that's pretty much the job, right? Of sort of creating the awareness, getting on the agenda, talking to people about how they do things now and how, things should evolve over time with legislation and what Apple and Google are up to and all that stuff. So it's a good time to be in the transformation of digital yet again.
Sure. So you're doing your association tour, of which, as you mentioned, you got a good amount of experience and coverage across two of the big Canadian ones. Was there kind of writing on the wall, or were there stories you were hearing from your customers at the association, advertisers, agencies, that made you think Arima was the place to be, or this mission of ID-less measurement was something that you needed to focus on?
For sure. Yeah, I mean, it's been going on for a long time, looking at how sort of these metrics are collected. And one of the things that started that journey was, we were having a discussion about ad fraud and sophisticated invalid traffic. And this happened a long time ago when it first sort of jumped out into the Wall Street Journal and the discussion with Michael Tiffany, who was leading that charge. Mm-hmm. And it became a question of like, well, what's actually real in this internet world of, trying to separate, human activity versus bot activity. And it's not just about the targeting. Like, people do focus on the IDs for the targeting and the building of profiles for targeting. But the other part of it, and probably the bigger part of it, is the connection between the media exposure and conversions. Mm-hmm. So essentially what has been always known as like last touch attribution or multi-touch attribution. And so when you start looking into these identifiers and trying to figure out, what's real and what's not, one of the questions was always, are these conversions actually real? And how much of that is just sort of messy bots landing on firing conversion pixels, to improve their cost or their yield in the programmatic space, and that's when you start getting into some pretty sort of nasty stuff that's happening in the ecosystem, where there's literally millions of dollars being slushed around, and the system is being gamed, and so. I mean, that's kind of weird, but it did lead me to getting us to join the Media Rating Council out of New York, and working with George and Ron Pinelli there, and trying to understand a lot better about invalid traffic, where does it come from, and the effect on the system, which was what we were doing at ACA. But it does sort of lead you to an area of like, are these cookies, really as good as they sound? And I do believe that we're in an area where there's a false sense of precision around things like, cost per acquisition on things, just because of the potential for sophisticated invalid traffic against the conversion pixel. And I know that's very much in the weeds, but I think the point is, that's a pretty critical metric that is being brought back to advertisers to say, here's your cost per acquisition on platform X versus platform Y, and here's how we've optimized it. And, there's a lot of activity around this sort of bridge between the media and the conversion that is actually quite messy.
Right, totally. Okay, so that's fascinating. So it really started with invalid traffic and this idea that cookies at times might not represent a person. and you leaned in, or you retracted at least first from the measurement angle. So if this is true, if cookies don't always represent a person, maybe some of these conversions aren't actually as meaningful as we thought they were. How does Arima solve that? So going from what you observed in the associations to your job now, how does Arima help sort of tackle that?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that is old is actually new again. When you start going into some of these areas where there's a challenge about, like how do we measure things, you go back to tried and true sort of principles and say, okay, well, we know a couple of things that are sort of hard metrics. Number one is there's the amount of money that's going in from the marketing budget into each of the channels. I mean, that's a guarantee, right? Because that's actual money. Mm-hmm. On the other side, there's actual money coming out in terms of sales. So there's a lot of data around both ends of those spectrums, and the mushy middle is where the problems lie. So, but if you look at going back to the future, I guess, marketing mix modeling started in 1949, I think it was. And, you take this principle and say, okay, well, you've got money in and money out, and in the middle, you have a bunch of math. You can suss out what's working and what's not working. Now, it's not, people would say, oh, it's not deterministic. And you say, well, clearly, the cookies aren't as deterministic as we thought in terms of that false sense of precision. So we're always making some sort of compromise in some way. And so when I started to investigate what marketing mix modeling has done in the past and what it can do now in the future, that, computing power is like, monstrously larger than it was, even 10 years ago. The data flows are faster. The demands are bigger. There's more fragmentation in terms of media challenges. The marketer not only wants to understand the various effects of media, but they also want to understand the effects of interest rates, COVID, trade promotions, influencers. So you have a wide scope. It all leads you towards something that is, at the scope of marketing mix modeling, but evolved marketing mix modeling. So taking the data that we can get out of, large platforms, and whether they're things like Adobe or whether it's Google or whatever, and bring it into the marketing mix modeling and make it faster, cheaper, more actionable, just a better marketing mix model, which of course doesn't rely on cookies or identifiers. So we're taking that out of that sort of problem out of the spectrum and advancing on very old principles.
But it's interesting, Chris, because it doesn't seem like that's the main problem you're solving. It seems more like you're solving the media effectiveness measurement challenge that advertisers have wrestled with for decades, and you're leaning in on recent tech advancements, trying to drive parameterization with your customers or agencies or advertisers, how they actually store information in a way that can be used the right way. But when you and I had originally connected, we were talking about how MMM is a great solution for cookieless, but it was really the last point you mentioned. You actually believe in MMM regardless of what's happening with the ID landscape, because you just think it's going to be better than cookie-based tracking, even if cookie-based tracking was to continue to exist.
Yeah, I mean, IDs are like first of all, you don't have to rely on an ID for an MMM, and so there's like this one path that says, let's evolve MMM. If we can bring in some personas and bring in some other, metrics into the thing, that may improve MMM along the way. And there's a lot of activity in the development of MMM or the evolution of MMM further than what it is, and we'll see where that goes. That in itself is exciting. On the point that you talked about of like, what do we do with other types of identifiers and the value of identifiers within the system? In some cases, I think that you can use them tactically. So, if you are working within a specific platform and it does offer some type of identifier, whether it's a cookie or whether it's some other type of ID, potentially there is some targeting advantage in there. And that remains to be seen at lower levels. I think the point is to disengage between the targeting and the evaluation. So if you want to work with platform A and use their targeting, profile targeting or whatever, you can tag that in a way that also shows up at the MMM level to say, look, did it work? right? Because you don't want to rely on that platform to give you the sense of not only, give us your media money and we'll show you that it works. You want to say, okay, I'm going to use your tactic or I'm going to use your media or whatever, but I want to evaluate it on a neutral scoreboard, aside from how that particular platform does it. Now, when you get into the platform of the MMM side, right, the data science platform, there's a lot of metrics in there that are not only valuable to the advertiser in terms of ROAS per channel and ROAS over time, but there's also metrics in there that could be really useful to publishers and media vendors, and also to agencies. Let's say, for instance, you're a media vendor and you have a new product and you're trying to figure out the value of that product. If you wanted to collaborate, you could help to see, what is the ROAS in that product that you've developed, and see if you can improve it in some way and work together between, buyer and seller to figure out what's the value of these things.
That seems like a much more honest and collaborative way to approach adding in new ad formats, as opposed to just assuming everything new is good and is going to perform great.
Yeah, I mean, if it's set up that way, a lot of that has to do with contracting and working collaboratively in terms of data access.
Right.
But I don't see a reason why MMM can't be a sort of a hub for agencies and vendors and buyers to come together and share certain views of the data that's generated through marketing mix modeling.
I love that. In terms of MMM for Canada versus the US, are there major differences in how they get executed? Do the way that we draw geographic boundaries, does that play a big factor?
Yeah, first of all, obviously the United States is like 18, 20 times bigger than Canada. So, we're kind of like a California off to the side, really. Obviously the differences are there's privacy legislation that is different in Canada versus the United States. And even within the United States, now you've got CCPA in California. And that's going to affect how you can target and measure things because of the consumer having a certain amount of power to determine how their identities and their data is going to be used, both in the targeting and the measurement of things. So that's a big difference. Canada's lived with privacy law for well over 20 years, and it's becoming more aggressive. So that means that identifiers are going to be treated a little bit more closer to what you would see in Europe with GDPR. In terms of the market, the United States has basically more marketing money per population. So you've got people who are willing to take a lot more risk with their media investments and their technology investments, and they'll try things. And they'll try things aggressively and really test it out. In Canada, there's less money, there's less tech startup, and so it's a much more conservative market. And so it's a little bit more challenging to try things out here. In Canada, we have postal codes, which are a geographic lens to look at the population. And in states, you have zip code, which is a much broader sort of, or DMAs, which are much broader than postal codes. So there's a difference in how we look at our sort of geo-cohorting structure, which gets into the weeds of things. Nonetheless, there's still census blocks or zip +4 to create really granular geo-cohorting approaches. And that becomes very interesting when you get into the hyper-local approach to targeting and measurement. Again, like let's say you're dealing with thousands of franchisees across the country. I mean, they know that there's an umbrella national campaign going on, but they're really interested in their local community of how many people are coming to my franchise, how many people are coming to my store, and who are the people that are within drive distance of my area, and how do I reach them with search and social and billboards and radio and all sorts of things, which becomes the combination between sort of like the hyper local media targeting and also being able to establish local regional MMMs, bring that together to show, that there's a sort of the national layer and then there's regional layers of measurement that can be brought to bear.
Well, just like in the US, I mean, you have these nice tidy cohorts of postal codes that many media companies store data on, advertisers store data on, agencies are keeping data on. Why not deploy those? Why not make better use of those?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, geography I think at this point is just underdeveloped or underrepresented in the discussion around targeting and measurement. I mean, there's some great companies doing, that have been there for a long time. But so much of the heated discussion has been around, cookies versus IDs, and we're creating these, IDs that are across, multiple different DSPs and things like that. And that sort of has stifled, I think, the conversation about the power of geography. And I think a lot of that has been just the fueling of ad tech that's like, oh boy, we have this, this platform that is, millions and millions of profiles and cookies and stuff that are already sitting there, and they're trying to sort of continually evolve the what it can do with these identifiers, into the future. But we have to recognize at some point in time, identifiers can be a big problem, and not just a big problem within the advertising or marketing sphere. It becomes a much bigger problem at the society level, when you have a database of every single individual in the country with all of their profiling and their movement data. You start to look at it a little bit differently, I think.
I think it's a great point, and it's fascinating that that's become the default route for most marketers, is to pursue that level of tracking rather than try something simpler. But I think you're right that ad tech has created this situation where we're attracted to complexity, technology, large lists of user IDs. I mean, it's the world I come from as well. So I think it's a product of our own doing. I'll use that to kind of drive you towards our last question. Then, when you look at your peers, when you look at advertisers and agencies that you speak with, how are we doing on addressing the changes to the ID landscape that we're seeing? Do you think, to your last point, are we a bit distracted on some of the higher tech solutions? Do you think that we're getting a good dose of that and a good dose of kind of the simpler way of viewing things, like you're trying to sell? Or what's kind of your assessment of our status today?
But I think two things. One is there's sort of the amortizing of previous investment. So, I mean, there's been a lot of investment into identifiers as a concept or as a framework. We need to track down to the individual, make the individual available as an impression in the bid request, and sort out pricing, through that, and then attribution towards the end. And that's kind of like the dogma right now of digital advertising, digital marketing, is everything is, the right ad to the right person at the right time, which is something we've been saying for a long time. And we have to recognize, I think, that there needs to be a different approach if digital advertising is going to mature and understand its place in the whole marketing ecosystem. Identified media, meaning media that has some kind of identifier attached to it, whether it's a cookie or whatever, is only about 50% of the marketing budget, right? Like, you still have trade promotions, you still have end dials, you still have radio, terrestrial radio, you still have linear TV, so in terms of a framework, you're only ever with IDs going to address half the market. And that means if you're going to try and sort of, as a marketer, look at your entire marketing budget and how it's deployed, and you're going to be asked the question, should I put money into, let's say, terrestrial radio versus something that has an identifier? You're blind as to how you do that unless you adopt something like MMM. So you have to get into cross-media world, which means you have to sort of leave behind the identifier world and get into something that's more probabilistic in terms of the attribution. So that means MMM, and it means more probabilistic at the planning level. And so what that means is you want to have a planning module at the front end that can do all of the things across all media and sort of come to reach and frequency campaigns, including MMM influence into the reach and frequency campaign. And what that means is you want to do two things. One is you want to move to a sort of geographic lens, because that's the Rosetta Stone that brings all media together. And the second thing is something that is very difficult right now to explain to people, but we're getting there, which is to get into synthetic data. And why you want to do this is when you're stuck with identifiers, then you're looking at match rates. you as an advertiser have a certain amount of data, and the seller has a certain amount of data, and you have to match, based on email addresses, phone numbers, whatever. But your match rate is going to be whatever it is. So you're not going to get everybody that you're looking for, and they don't have everybody, and you don't have everybody. So you get into a place where even if at best you have, let's say, 70% match, you're still missing huge parts of your target. Now, synthetic data doesn't have that problem. What we built out is a synthetic population. We call it the Synthetic Society. In Canada, there's 38 million Canadians, and we have 38 million synthetic Canadians in our database. Each of those 38 million have about 5,000 attributes attached to them. The beauty about synthetic data is because it's synthetic, privacy law does not apply as long as you don't add in any sort of identifiers that's tracked back to a person, like a specific person. Literally, it is a fictional person that has been synthesized from a wide variety of data sets, things like the census. And we're at the very beginning right now of understanding what we can do with synthetic data in the marketing group. Synthetic data has been used in medical for quite a long time because of the sensitivity of the health data that needs to get used for research. And so when you look at the advances that have been done in the medical sphere, you say, well, why can't we just do that in marketing? And why don't we just use synthetic populations in marketing and abandon or not or sort of deprecate, these deterministic cookie-based profiling systems? Anyway, it gets very complicated, but it's pretty interesting stuff.
I think it's fascinating, and it's a great way to bridge the gap between using the data assets that you have in terms of one-to-one and taking advantage of geographic data sets and kind of establishing an intersection. I love what you guys are doing with Synthetic Society.
Yeah, it's kind of it's like finding out about the data that you don't have. Right, because everyone's like, "Oh, we got first-party data," and you're all excited about it. It's like, yeah, but you don't have first-party data on everybody in the country,
right?
Unless maybe the government does, but the thing is, you need to be able to balance or compare the first-party data that you have against a truth set to understand where your indices lie,
and not totally ignore the consumers that you don't have that sort of information.
Yeah. Those are your prospects, right? Like, even the largest banks or the largest car companies, I mean, they don't have data about every single person in the country. And their footprints are very large, but if they want to grow in certain areas, they have to be able to find, where are those prospects and what are those prospects doing and how can we bring them into, turning them into leads and converting them, the usual stuff.
Right, sure. All right. Well, thanks, Chris. I think that's a great note for us to end on today. Super appreciate you making time to chat and sharing your insights with our audience. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, Tom. I really appreciate our chats. I hope you're doing well with SugarFree and all of that, and hope things are doing well.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that, Chris. And for our audiences, if you enjoyed this conversation, go ahead and click the subscriber bell on my profile to follow me. And if you want to learn about the fastest way to get the benefits of ditching the cookie, head to sugarfreeadvertising.com or drop me a DM. Thanks for joining.
Okay, cheers.